I'm Patricia Ezechie, and this is Proactive Empowered Careers, a space for thinking about careers differently, not as something separate from who you are, but as an expression of you and the life you want to live. Hello everyone and welcome back. In the last episode, we talked about something I think is really important. And that was this whole idea of the and. The idea that two things can be true at the same time, that your situation can be difficult and you still have choice within it, that things may not be ideal and yet you're not powerless inside of that. And that really shifts things because it places you back front and center in your own life. Not as someone everything is happening to, but as someone who still has a say in how their life unfolds. But once you begin to see that, something else begins to become very real. Because it's one thing to recognize that you have a choice, and it's another thing entirely to feel able to do anything with it. And this is where a lot of us get stuck. Not because we don't understand what's happening, but because our life, as it's currently set up, isn't supporting what we actually want to do. And that's what I want to talk about today. Our life structures. Because how your life is set up shapes far more than you might realize. When you start looking at your life honestly, you begin to notice things. Where you feel energized, where you feel drained, where something feels right, where something doesn't, where you feel like yourself and where you're performing. How much agency, control, and power you feel you have in your life and where you don't. And that insight and clarity is really important. But it also brings with it something else, a kind of pressure. Because you can see all of it now. The things that aren't right, the things you want to change, the possibilities you've been ignoring, and the cost of staying where you are. And this can lead to questions like, so if I can see all of this, why am I not doing anything about it? Why am I still here? And that's often followed by questions like, what's wrong with me? And that's where I want to pause for a moment. Because most of the time, that's not actually the right or even helpful question to be asking. Not because you don't have a role to play in your life and career, of course you do, but because that question misses something fundamental. Clarity on its own doesn't automatically lead to movement or progress or change. Seeing something clearly doesn't automatically mean you act on it. You don't make decisions in isolation. You make them inside your life, inside your day-to-day, inside your energy, inside your responsibilities, inside everything that you're already carrying. And all of that taken in the round has an impact. It shapes what is actually available to you in any given moment, and that matters. Because when the demands placed upon you are high and the resources available to you are low, you have less energy, your capacity shrinks, and everything becomes harder. We see this all the time. Clarity is not the same as capacity. It's not just about what you want, it's about what your system can actually sustain. So when you find yourself thinking, I know what I want, but I'm not doing it, sometimes it isn't avoidance and sometimes it isn't fear. Sometimes there just isn't enough space in your life to do what you want to do. Not just time, space. The kind of space where you can actually think, where you can sit with something long enough to understand what's really happening, what's really going on. Where you can tolerate a bit of uncertainty without needing to shut down straight away because it all feels too much. And without that space, without that capacity, then even the clearest insight ends up going nowhere. So don't think for a minute that this is a get out of jail card. It doesn't mean you don't have a choice. Of course you do. That hasn't changed. But it does mean that the way your life is currently set up either supports the choices you're making or makes them harder to act on. And I've seen it in my own life. There was a point where I could see very clearly that something wasn't working. In fact, it was very wrong, and nothing was changing. Nothing was moving. And for a long time, I thought that meant I needed to try harder, to be clearer, to be more decisive, to push through. But the reality was very different. My life as it was then wasn't set up so that I would have the time that I needed to make the kind of change I wanted to make. I was exhausted. My capacity was low, and there wasn't any space. And it wasn't until that became impossible to ignore for me, physically and mentally, as much as anything else, that I started to change the structure around me. I had to. And as that changed, my thinking changed. What felt impossible started to feel possible again. So the way your life is structured is either supporting you or quietly working against you. And this is where I think a lot of career conversations fall short. They focus on you, quite rightly, of course they should, but just the bit of you that's about your mindset, your confidence, and your decisions, all really important, but not the whole picture. Because when you make decisions, you're not making them in isolation, you're making them inside your life. And the way your life is currently set up has a direct impact on what feels possible to you, what you have energy for, what you have space for, what you feel able to act on. So if we only look at you, especially through that narrow lens of your career conversations, and ignore the conditions you're operating in and living inside, we miss something fundamental. We miss the reality of what you're actually living. And that's the shift I want to make today. Instead of asking, why am I still here? What's wrong with me? Why can't I get myself together? Why can't I make this work? A more useful question is, what do I actually have available to me right now? Do you have energy, or are you running on empty? Do you have time to think, or is every part of your day already spoken for? Do you have space to question things, or are you constantly responding to the next thing in front of you? Because if you don't have the time, or the energy, or the space, of course nothing is moving. And that isn't failure, it's information. It's information about what your life is currently set up to support and what it's quietly making harder. Because your environment shapes your choices. Now, this is where we need to be careful. This isn't about saying, well, life is busy, so I can't do anything. This is not an excuse to stay stuck, because you still have choice, you still have agency, and that hasn't gone. That's still very present. But it does change where you start, because sometimes the next step isn't the big decision. It's adjusting the structure around you. It's looking at your life and asking, what needs to change here so I can actually do something about what I want? And that might look like creating a little bit of space, protecting a piece of your time, letting something go, reducing what's draining you even slightly. And sometimes, honestly, it's about taking better care of yourself, resting, recovering, actually allowing your system to recover so you can access the part of you that can think clearly again. Because when that life structure changes, even a little, everything changes. Your thinking changes. Your clarity deepens. Your options expand. What felt impossible starts to feel possible again. And we begin to move without forcing or pushing, but because we now have more capacity. You can take a first step, however small, and that's enough. So if you're waiting to feel completely clear before you do anything, here's the reality. Sometimes just a small change in how your life is set up is what creates the space for that clarity to come through. I've seen it over and over again. The life you build determines the career you can sustain. It shapes what you can see, what you feel and believe is possible, what you feel able to do, where you feel able to act. So if you're in a place right now where something is getting clearer, but nothing is moving or nothing is changing, just pause before you judge yourself and take a look at the structure you're living inside. Look at how your life is currently set up and notice, what is this structure making easy and what is it making difficult? Because that right there is where your next step is. Not in forcing a decision, but in changing the conditions around that decision so that that movement that you're looking for becomes possible. Because even a slight change is enough for you to begin. So next time, we're going to build on what we started here today. Because if your life structure shapes how you can act and your ability to take action, then the space you have within that structure becomes critical. The space to think clearly, to hear yourself clearly, and to even begin to see what you want. We've begun to touch on that today, but next time we'll unpack it more fully. So for now, just notice your life as it is. Not what you think you should be doing, but how things actually are. Because that structure that you're in is shaping far more than you might realize. So until next time, take the very best care of yourself. This has been Proactive Empowered Careers. If today's episode resonated, subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss what comes next. And remember, your career isn't separate from who you are. It's an expression of you and the life you want to live.